All right, thank you everybody for joining us today. We are going to talk about deaccessioning, which we've been promising for a couple months now. So today's topic will be how to deaccession. Just a couple quick notes. First, to introduce myself. If you are new to joining us for our webinars, I'm Rachel Christine Woody. I'm the founder and director of Relicura, and I have 20 years in archives, museums, and cultural heritage institutions. And in addition to being a business owner, I am a consultant, author, speaker, and people first advocate. A little bit of housekeeping. A link to this recording and any of the links that we share today for resources, of which there will be a lot. All of the ones that we mentioned, we will send in a follow-up email tomorrow, so 24 hours from now. And if you are joining us live for the premiere, we will also be putting these resource links into the chat as we cover them. So you'll have them in a couple different places. Also, this session is pre-recorded, so I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you, while also be able to answer follow-up questions in the chat. So while we're in premiere mode, I'll also be in the chat and can answer any further questions you may have. And because we are able to use the chat box in premiere mode, please feel free to share your own examples, especially if you have resources to share, any questions. Just keep in mind that because we are using the YouTube platform, that YouTube tends to require you have a YouTube or Google account to sign in before you can use the chat, just to make sure you're not a chat bot or something else, I guess. And this video, because we are using the YouTube platform, we get the benefits of the YouTube Play toolbar, so you can enable closed captioning if you need it. You can also expand, depending on the screen that you're viewing this video in, you can expand to different qualities. And then finally, just please remember that this is my content and my intellectual property, and to be respectful of that, unless we're specifically talking and citing someone else. A quick disclaimer, because some of the stuff we talk about is going to venture into some legal/accounting aspects. I am not a legal expert, and so the content shared here is intended to be provided as guidance and to share resources. So please follow up with any sort of experts that you need. I am very much an archives museum specialist, not a specialist in anything else. We've got a pretty full agenda because there's quite a bit to cover on the topic of deaccessioning to do it justice. We also got in tons of questions for this webinar, which makes sense because it's an important and multifaceted topic. So we will do our best. I'm going to do my best to keep pacing with our content so that we can get to everything and try and stick as close to the hour mark as we can. But that said, we'll give a brief introduction, concept of deaccession, definitions. We'll cover considerations. What are all of the things that we should be considering when we are thinking about deaccessioning a collection? We'll talk about the news because especially in these last few years, there's been quite a bit of news coverage about some pretty controversial deaccessioning that has happened. So we'll take a look at that. We'll then get into best practices from the field because we should make sure we are referencing those for when we ultimately create or update our policies. So we have many different policies of which we've covered in some of our previous webinars. And this particular topic for deaccession, you should have a specific deaccession policy. So we'll talk about what that looks like, what to include. We are going to spend some time then talking about the act of disposal and the different options that you have, why you may consider one over the other, all of those things in terms of what it means to dispose of something, why, how do you choose which one, that kind of stuff. And then lots of great questions that, of course, touch on some of the content we're covering, but asking in more specific scenarios. So we will cover those as well. Okay, introduction. Deaccession defined. So when we are talking about deaccessioning, we're talking about the permanent removal of an item or items from a collection. And for our webinar today, we're going to be talking about deaccession, both in a museum collection context, but also in an archives collection context. While the collections are, of course, different, the act of deaccession and, for the most part, the policy and considerations for deaccession are pretty mutual. And before I move off the definition, deaccessioning, I want to emphasize, is part of collection management. It is not separate from, it is not an optional in addition to, it is very much part of our collection stewardship. It's a normal activity for any collecting institution to do, and it is often a required activity for the health and vitality of the remaining collection. For most of you here today, you probably already know this, but sometimes it can be very helpful to point that out to some of the other people you may be gently educating, whether that is educating up to your director or your board, or also educating out to our community who do have vested interest in what it is that we keep and display, as well as what it is that we may get rid of. Disposal defined. So I want to make sure we cover this one too, because this one can be more confusing for our collections management folks. Disposal is the disposition method, so broader term here, used for the removal of items from the collection. And that can mean removal and transfer to be deposited at a peer institution. It could be like literal disposal. It needed to be thrown away or recycled. It could be selling. So disposal itself is not just the, oh, we threw it away disposal. Disposal is the actual method of removing that item from the collection and then doing that, whichever disposal method you choose, out of your collection to somewhere else. All right, when to deaccession. First one, when the items are determined to not be a fit for the collection. For so many of us, both museum and archive collections have definitely made their way to us with little documentation, and so it can be very normal for us to, once we do finally get a collecting mission and assess holdings that made their way to us, there are oftentimes items that never should have been accepted, and in this case don't fit whatever your collecting mission is. The second one is when the items can no longer be taken care of according to best practices. Depending on items, their particular preservation needs or storage or display needs, it could be beyond the capabilities of the current museum. Maybe the item is just so fragile or made of such specific rare materials that it really needs to go to somewhere else that has that kind of expertise. Third, when items are damaged, they're so damaged that they're hazardous to the other items in the collection. We have a Q&A we'll get to a little later, but essentially where the items were stored, they got damaged, and they got damaged to the point where there is some yucky stuff that could migrate to the rest of the collections. And in that case, that part of the collection that got damaged is now hazardous and poses a risk to the rest of the collections. And so in that case, you need to separate and remove the things that are damaged, and especially if they are beyond repair. And then finally, when there's little to no room or resources for the collection size. As we are collecting, and if there wasn't really a collecting mission or criteria, and or even if you had perfect acquisitions and accessioning that were always on theme, at the end of the day, we all have a specific size and storage restriction, as well as a staff capacity restriction. So we need to make sure that we take into account staff time, storage space, etc., and that is in balance with the amount of collections you have to ensure that the collections are cared for and managed in the way that they should be. All right, how to deaccession. We want to make sure when we do the act of deaccessioning and when there's that disposal element, that we're doing it according to our policy. And that is our policy as the collecting unit. So whether you are collections management registrar in a museum, if you're in archives in a university or another museum, you want to make sure you're following your department's policy. But also, if you are underneath a higher museum or consortium, a university perhaps, if there are any other policies that may impact what your policy does, you want to make sure that those are checked and in alignment. Second, you want to make sure that you deaccession according to the deed of gift. Now, in many cases, there's not a deed of gift, right? And we'll definitely cover that scenario. In other cases, there's a deed of gift, but it's pretty loose. It doesn't even mention deaccessioning, which is also fairly normal for back in the day sort of deed of gift forms, in which case there may be some additional steps to make sure you reach out to the donor before you proceed with any other disposal methods. And we'll get into those details in a little bit. And then finally, if you do have a deed of gift that stipulates the process or the policy that you have for when and how you may deaccession, that you are following what the donor agreed to, specifically, usually with the deed of gift form, the donor can indicate like, I want right of first refusal. So if you decide to deaccession, please ask me or next of kin first before you dispose, transfer to another organization or recycle or whatever, depending on what it is. So you'll want to make sure that you honor the agreement if it was there. Also, as informed by museum or archival best practices, of which we will get into as part of our creating the policy section for deaccessioning, you'll want to make sure for both ethical and legal implication kind of reasons that you are following those best practices. They are best practices for a reason. And then finally, as informed by governing laws. In the topic of deaccessioning, the main legal area we want to consider here is that abandoned property area, which it may be more familiar to you as found in collection, FIC. And that is when you literally find things in the collection of which you have no documentation for, nor any institutional memory as to where it came from who, when, etc. And the benefits of deaccessioning. So again, you are likely very aware that there are benefits as a fellow collections manager or archivist, so this slide may be more helpful for your education to your director or board or whomever, but we'll state here for the record, benefits of deaccessioning helps to ensure adequate resources are dedicated to the items that actually do fit your collection and that do fit the goals of the institution. It can free up space and other resources for you to be able to bring in new acquisitions. And this particular bullet point is one of few acceptable areas according to museum best practices as to when you are allowed to sell or deaccession part of your collection in order to make room for new acquisitions. Also, it can assist in addressing issues of provenance, poor past practices, and be part of repatriation. So items make their way into our collection that perhaps never should have left their community of origin. And so deaccessioning from the museum as like an active process can help in repairing those relationships and having those items repatriated back to their communities of origin. And then finally, another benefit, it can rectify or prevent hazardous conditions for the permanent collection. So things that are moldy, are infested with pests, that are so acidic that they're just bleeding through boxes with acidity, all of those things that can cause risk to the rest of your collections should be isolated and in most cases removed. Considerations. So there are quite a few things to consider and be aware of as you approach the topic of deaccession and the creation of policy. And so first thing is the concept of policies, thinking about what is in place, especially if you've got some previous drafts you can work with. Equally as important is if there are like an absence of policy, a complete void of policy, thinking about agreements, in which case for deaccession, the deed of gift is most common, but any sort of agreement that you have relating to the maintaining of collection items, how they're cared for or gotten rid of, those kinds of things. Any sort of laws that take place, for example, we spoke of about the abandoned property law that we'll get into some more detail on. And then there are the ethics we want to consider, and I have some articles and headlines for us to take a look at when we think about ethics, when we're also thinking about feelings and feelings that come up for people when we're talking about disposal of things, and of course the optics, because especially in these last few years, there have been quite a few headlines that have garnered major eyeballs and viewership in terms of why are museums selling artwork? Is that even allowed? Is some of the public questioning. So, taking a look at how those optics have played out, especially in recent memory, and what that means in terms of consideration on our part. Because again, deaccessioning is a normal part of collections stewardship. We know that. Not a lot of other people outside of our jobs know that. And so that's part of the education piece, but you can also understand why that would be alarming if you didn't know that museums could uh, deaccession items. That would also be quite shocking if you weren't aware of that being a normal thing. So we'll get into some detail for all of these. So first part, check the policies. Check your collection policy, even if it doesn't have a specific deaccession section in your policy. Sometimes it is referenced. So especially if you're not the one that wrote the collection policy, or if you're like an archives department underneath a broader museum institution level, perhaps there's museum policy that impacts anything that you would write or incorporate for the archive collection policy, which gets into our second bullet, larger institutional policy. So whether that is a museum, a university, anything that would dictate or supersede what you would create for your own collection policy, making sure you're referencing those and that they're not in conflict with what the larger institutional policy will be. And then industry best practices or suggested policies. So we do have a section where we'll get into some of those examples, but as you're going through this sort of policy review, checking these different areas for where there may be policies to look at, policies to incorporate, policies to reference as you either craft or update your own deaccession policy. Check the agreements. So first and foremost, what commitments were made to the donor? In a perfect world, any sort of commitments or agreements were documented on one piece of paper, and that piece of paper is called the deed of gift. That is not always the case. I have worked in many places where there are accession files that can be quite full with different correspondence on what was agreed to, at least via email correspondence, versus what actually made it onto the deed of gift. All of those files should be referenced if possible, because so many times, especially in the earlier days, there would be a lot of concessions or exceptions made for certain donors for taking in that collection. And even if it's not on the deed of gift or something like very official, it still could be a binding agreement for you to have to adhere to, especially if it's in some sort of writing. So check all of the files. Second of which, whether there's that agreement in place or not, if the agreement's in place and it specifically states you need to offer it back to the donor first, then do that. That's what was agreed to. Offer it back to the donor. If the donor has passed, you offer it back to the next of kin. If there is no next of kin, or if they pass on it, then you can move to your next steps in your disposal. But do need to adhere to if there is that offer of return. And a promise not to sell. So some of the agreements may have stipulated, look, you can deaccession it, but you cannot sell it. So that means of your disposal methods, you, if not returning to the donor, if not selling it, perhaps you are transferring it to a different peer institution that could use it or have interest in acquiring it, or some sort of other method, maybe moving it to the educational collection or something. So any sort of promises or understandings that your institution had with that donor when you took that object in need to be ascertained, and then they need to be adhered to. Check the local laws. So ARCS, which is the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists, have a resource. It is a little on the older side, 2018. So would love to have it updated. But of course, ARCS is also a volunteer ran organization, so totally get it. However, it should be a great place for you to start. This particular link on here is I think it's a PDF, and it lists all of the states and the specific state law, if there is one, related to property acts or abandoned loan legislation. Because much like we can have items that just like made their way into our collection without any sort of agreement, whether verbal or written, there can also be abandoned loans where perhaps a private individual loaned something of her great grandmother's for an exhibit and then just like never came back for it. So they're sort of the two areas where things can make it to the museum and then never leave. And these different laws are documented through this ARCS document. Again, it was made in 2018, so definitely find and make sure you're referencing the most up-to-date for your state. However, this should be a great place to get you started, especially since, bless their hearts, they have also provided you a legal citation. So even if the link doesn't work, if you know how to interpret the legal citation, you can find what you're looking for there. So thanks to ARCS and this volunteer committee who put this together. All right, consider the ethics. When we're thinking about ethics, some of which will be covered in like museum and archives best practices, but in general, when we're considering ethics for any sort of decisions we're making with our collections that were made and enjoyed by humans, we need to consider the why, how, and the who benefits. So for deaccessioning, we need to think about why we are deaccessioning, the potential implications of deaccessioning, what potential harm could be done from that deaccessioning, or perhaps from the disposal method that we choose. When we're thinking about the how, so getting into if we're deaccessioning, the how of how we interact with that donor or their next of kin, the how in terms of whether we're choosing disposal in the trash versus disposal to the education collection, thinking about the how and the ethics around that. And then the who benefits. While there can definitely be very positive instances where the museum can benefit, whether reputationally or monetarily, you can also understand that the optics as well as the ethics can be questionable when we're seeing the museum benefit, but perhaps at the detriment to a cultural community that has already had a history of being mistreated and marginalized. So there are a lot of factors to consider when we're thinking about ethics, but to boil it down, it really is a do no harm mentality and focusing on all of the potential people that your decisions around deaccessioning will impact. So we'll get into some specifics for what that looks like in terms of policy, but just to get your brains thinking about what we mean about ethics and what the considerations are for us when we're thinking about deaccession ethics. And feelings. Feelings are a little bit different than ethics, but as you can imagine, there's quite a bit of crossover and parallel. And we want to make sure that we're considering, in addition to collections care, which is where we're coming from, in terms of wanting to take the best care of our collections based on the capacity and resources that we have. We want to consider the feelings of the public, because for most of us, we are nonprofit, public serving institutions. And in fact, many of our best practices around deaccessioning refer to us, museums and archives, as a public trust, where we house public goods that are supposed to be of benefit to the public, which is part of the reason why it can seem so scandalous when a museum or archives gets rid of something that is seen as something that was for the public. So considering the feelings of the public, number one. Feelings of the individual, number two. So thinking about the individual, whether that was the donor of the collection, whether that was the creator of the collection, whether that is the individuals of a cultural community where that particular collection or item was created and intended to be used and enjoyed rather than in a museum, for example, and the feelings of the field. And I don't know if I would have added this bullet point if this was a couple of years ago, but when we take a look at the headlines a little later in this webinar, and if you read some of the articles that we share later, you'll notice and pick up on a lot of feelings from the field about what some of our other peers were doing and the decisions they were making. So while I would hate to have other outside peers dictate necessarily what your deaccession policy is or the choices that you make, you do need to be aware of and perhaps consider the feelings of those peers in the field. So you'll see what I mean in a little bit. And then finally, consider the optics. So the public perception is that museums and archives should never dispose of items. That's not a hard and fast fact, but I'm pretty sure we can say the majority of outside people believe that museums and archives are supposed to just take everything in forever and ever. 2, if policies aren't broadcast or available publicly, then when your museum or archives does dispose of something, it can appear like it's unethical because it seems shrouded in mystery, or like that you're doing it quietly or like surreptitiously. So to combat some of that with like some proactive education, having something like your collection policy and deaccession policies online where the public can access them can greatly help with some of the optics when you do perform a normal function of collection stewardship, which is to deaccession. 3, if the disposal is one of selling, it can appear that the organization is doing deaccessioning for the wrong reasons. So again, optically, like if it appears that the museum is benefiting, especially in a monetarily sense, if it's getting money, it can seem suspicious to the public, who again thinks that museums and archives keep everything forever and ever and that they should never financially benefit from their collections. And then finally, if the disposal is one of destruction, it can seem that the organization is doing something it shouldn't. So selling is like a hot button, but also like disposal, destruction, like recycle, burning, burying, throwing away, can also seem incredibly counterintuitive or like anti anything that museum and archives are supposed to stand for, which is like to preserve everything forever and ever. So as you can see, some of these optics, you're performing something in a way that you should. Deaccessioning is normal. You have a deaccessioning policy. You're doing deaccessioning, which according to policy, so like nothing should be scandalous here. And yet, because optics are created by an external and very public perception, you need to be aware of what that public perception is, what their understanding is of, in this case, the act of deaccessioning, and how certain activities of deaccessioning can make it seem like we're doing something bad, something wrong, something shady, something bad. So being aware of the optics so that you can be proactive and transparent and communicative is incredibly important if you don't want to become a bad headline. Speaking of which, the news. So this particular slide has 3 different articles from the New York Times in this period of like the last 2 to 3 years. So we're getting like early COVID days into 2023, is late 2023, I think is one of my latest articles. But you can see the discussion of, museums vote to allow the sale of art. And it does specify for care of collections, so that's nice. But for reasons we'll get into in a second, that was like a huge difference from what it used to be, because it used to only be allowed where you could sell art, but for the specific acquisition of just other different art. So to be able to sell art, to just care for the collections as the remaining exist, was a huge shift for the field. Not that the public knows that. Selling art to pay the bills divides the nation's museum directors. And so they're referring to the Association of Art Museum Directors, AAMD, and their policies in terms of whether you can sell and deaccession art and what can you do with those proceeds. It used to just be collect more art. This, because of COVID, changed due to hardship and needing to be able to have flexibility on where that money goes, etc. And then to our last headline over here on the right, 2 museums tried to sell art. Only one caught grief about it. So as you look at it and as you're hearing some of these stories where one was able to sell art, no problem, no scandal, another one seemingly doing the same thing, different, got lots of grief about it. And in this case, the Baltimore Museum of Art ended up pulling the art from the, I think, Sotheby's auction, like in the 11th hour. So it's just a smattering of New York Times articles. So we could do a whole other webinar on the controversy of selling art, and I would love to do that. So maybe we'll do that later in the year. But just to touch on it briefly here, since it could be an avenue of disposal for you, this is why it's controversial. First and foremost, the collections that we have are seen as existing purely for the public good. So museums and archives, the reason we exist in like a ethereal way, not in like a literal way, is because we are here to collect and preserve things, history, art, and culture, not for us, but for the public. And so all of those collections are considered under the public trust and are for the public good. And again, this is not written down anywhere as a formal law, nor is it necessarily something that could be enforced in a legal way. And yet that is the predominant, like, universal understanding and agreement that we have all made with each other. That impacts public trust, not in a different from the art is a public for the public trust, and different, and is like the public trusting museums as an institution and trusting them to do the right thing, trusting them to take care of items, trusting museums and archives to share histories in a responsible way. So the public controversy of selling is that it shakes that trust that the public has in us as institutions. Additionally, it can very much look like, and in some cases can be, the literal definition of cannibalizing the collection. So depending on what it is that's being deaccessioned, depending on selling it, but for what purpose, where will those proceeds go? Is that deemed acceptable both by the larger museum field as well as the general public? And it can seem like an unsustainable and distasteful action of picking apart parts of your collection to the overall detriment in order to take care of some of the other parts of your collection. Another controversial reason is that it could be fiduciary irresponsibility, specifically in most cases from the boards. And for many of the headlines of scandalous art sales, usually it's scandalous because there's some sort of insinuation that the board member is selling this piece of art because they want to acquire this other piece of art because they're friends with the artist or something. So it can seem irresponsible from, like, there's a favoritism and decisions made not based on policy. It can also seem like irresponsibility because the job of the board is to help take care of the museum in a financial sense and guide them to be financially responsible and successful. And if they're selling the collection to help that, and getting into our next point, you can't continue to sell the collection and have that money go to museum operations, because at some point you will run out of collections to sell to keep the museum operational. And so if the board is not being responsible with the money for the museum, it can lead to unsustainable sales to help shore up operations, which asterisk is probably one of the reasons that the policy, according to American Alliance of Museums, as co-signed by the Art Association of Museum Directors, that the sales should never go to operations. Like, there was some brief flexibility during COVID, but it's not, your sales can't go to operations. They can't stop you necessarily, not in a legal sense, but they will definitely, there's sanctions that can happen if you do that would prevent some of your other museum operations from happening, if you make that choice. And finally, museums exist to sustain art, not the reverse. And so again, this public and more ethereal concept of that art, history, culture, whatever it is in your museum and archives collections, exists, your institution exists to take care of those collections, not the museum and archives exists to sell the collections. So it it seems like you're doing something that is not even part of the job description in a way, in terms of getting rid of the collections. All right, best practices in the field or from the field that we need to incorporate into our policies. Okay, best practices, bit of an introduction. Obviously, over time, best practices for museums and archives has evolved. And specifically, there's been some evolution around COVID-19, global pandemic, some of the hardships that incurred, specifically financial hardships on the part of archives and museums and their organizations needing to close, impact to financial streams, etc. And that triggering specifically a loosening in the restrictions for the American Alliance of Museums and the Association of Art Museum Directors, both of which had a code of ethics around when one could consider selling artwork, and if you did, what those proceeds were allowed to go to. Beforehand, before COVID, it was only allowed to fund the purchase of new art. During COVID, it loosened to include money to go towards collections care, and I believe loosened up enough and had flexibility towards that could include staff in charge of collections care, and some major flexibility around some potential temporary operations kind of funding. Now that we're sort of through the worst of it, so to speak, economically for the COVID-19 pandemic, the restrictions have come back to still allowing money for collections care, but it's very, very much restricted and frowned upon to use the funds for staff, even if it is for collections care, in addition to not operations, for reasons we touched on a little earlier, in terms of if you're operating a museum, it needs to be financially sustainable, and you can't continue to sell your collection because you will eventually run out of your collection. Plus, also, isn't it your job to keep the collection, kind of stuff. So orientation and context for like where it started, how it changed, some of the change back. It very much includes the concept of the public trust. So again, even though there are no laws, so to speak, saying that for all of the collections in museums and archives that they belong to the public, or that there is this beholdenness in a legal sense to the public. However, because of the nature of museums and archives, and typically they are nonprofit and public serving organizations, there is that concept of them performing work and within the public trust. Also, we must take into account the state and federal laws. So like the very literal laws that could apply in a federal sense, I'm meaning mostly like if you are selling art, especially if you're in a museum that is selling millions of dollars worth of art, there are tax implications depending on what and how with the money managed, etc. which is why sometimes you see headlines with the FBI being involved with a federal level investigation regarding museums selling art. State laws are more toward, typically I'm thinking like more the abandoned property and needing to make sure that you've waited the requisite amount of time according to your state and its laws on when property is considered officially abandoned and you can get rid of it if you do not have any sort of paperwork or paper trail indicating that the object was donated or gifted or whatever to you. Finally, best practices are built to avoid triggering those federal level issues for those tax exempt organizations, and for the most part, including some of those state level laws. And I would add best practices, especially those that are used as guidelines or handed down by the professional organizations, to also include the ethical things that museums and archives have to sort of grapple with or make their way through when we are talking about deaccessioning parts of our collections and when we are considering different disposal methods, some of which include generating revenue. Speaking of which, so I mentioned we started out super restrictive. On the left-hand side was a previous art museum, the Association of Art Museum Directors stance. I think this one was from 2011, and very clearly stating that the highlighted section, deaccessions only to acquire other works of art. Proceeds are never to be used for operating funds. And then coming out, and you'll notice this is 2022, AAMD and now AAM have aligned into like a mutual agreement on policy where when you read the larger press statement, it is that swinging back to only to acquire new art, and then some very specificness around like, yeah, maybe also collections care. And if you have more questions about ethics and about the sale, like selling of objects specifically, including concepts of public trust and public good, AAM does have basically like a Q&A blog post that is pretty helpful on most of the questions you could possibly have on this particular area of the subject. So please go check that out. Of course, they have several other resources on ethics. I did check for this particular link, and you can access this Q&A without it being behind the AAM paywall. All right, so getting into create policy, now that we have all that context and some additional resources to go reference for more detail, we need to start thinking about what our deaccession policy will look like. So in terms of content, we need to make sure we reference our collecting mission. If you have not created your collecting mission yet, or you feel like you need to update it, go and do that first. And there's a whole other webinar if you need it on that. Second, you need to reference an agreement that exists between donor and organization. Even if you didn't have one before, you should have one now. Yeah, you should have one now, and you should reference it in your deaccession policy. Even if within your organization it's like in draft mode or what have you, it's very important to make sure you have those pieces and that they're referencing each other, because that's how a policy can exist and function, is with these other features. And then create criteria for deaccessioning. So we've talked about a couple different things as we've moved along in terms of what would make an item eligible for considering to deaccession. There are many different criteria to consider, some of which will depend on your type of organization, the type of collection you have, the history of collecting at your institution, how sort of wild or not it was. So there may be different criteria for your museum or archives, separate from a peer museum or archives. Then outline scenarios for when items may be considered for deaccession. So as deaccessioning can be a normal part of our collection stewardship, I would recommend you mentioning in your policy and actually doing periodic review of your collection with the intent to deaccession items that, if they hit that criteria, then deaccession them. That way, it's not this overwhelming thing that builds up over time. It's perhaps more of an annual or every other year, or pick a thing that makes sense for you in terms of the amount of stuff that comes in, how much space restriction you have, stuff like that. In addition to, there may be other scenarios like, if we move storage facilities, if we have an abrupt decrease in staff, things like that that would trigger a major, we have to look at everything now to possibly deaccession. I also recommend stipulating how items will be deaccessioned, so having a specific section on disposal methods, of which we'll still cover in a bit more detail in just a moment, and identifying criteria for those disposal methods. So what would be more in line and appropriate to sell versus what may be more appropriate to give back to like community of origin, or what may be more appropriate to destroy because the content itself is harmful, whether in terms of like the content or the actual material. Criteria for deaccessioning. So this is the typical stuff that pretty much everybody should have in there, in addition to your like special case to you kind of criteria. First of all, doesn't fit or no longer fits in your collecting mission, is a lesser version of similar items, is a duplicate of original materials, and especially looking at you archives with photocopies, etc. And similarly is a non-original material. For both archives and museums, the type of collection items you should be acquiring for the most part should be original. Another item in here is damage beyond repair. So it could be an original item, it could be something that fits the collecting mission, but if it's covered in mold or it's just like beyond recognition because it's so broken, for many reasons, it may be time to get rid of it. So for those 2 bullet points, it could be damage beyond repair, or it is itself so damaged and yet also so hazardous that it's a risk to the other collections. And finally, is an outsized portion of a collection, as in there are too many similar items in your collection for that one thing, that it's not allowing you to collect in any other depth or breadth in other areas of your collection. And the concept found in collection. So this has sort of popped up in a couple of our other webinars leading to deaccessioning today, and that is the concept of items being found in your collection, as in these items made their way to somehow your museum or archives. There's no paperwork, or at least no paperwork that includes like a donor name or any sort of donor agreement. There may be some institutional memory in terms of like, yeah, we've had that since like 1980. Or like, I think maybe the Johnson family gave that to us. So you may have some like rumors in terms of provenance, but essentially it's just something that is found there. You're not sure how it got there, not a lot of detail. So that is the concept of an item being found in collection, and there's some implications to this. For policy examples, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, the Spurlock Museum of World Cultures, go check out their policy. It is pretty thorough, and it does a great job of referencing, in this case, the state of Illinois' abandoned property law. So you'll get a sense of how to reference, applicable state law and then build policy on that foundation, specifically for undocumented property or otherwise found in collection kind of stuff. Archives-wise, the Society of American Archivists have a reappraisal and deaccessioning document. It's from 2017, so it's like a smidge old. However, much of the content still stands. Very similar to museums in terms of what that policy is going to look like, but I recommend you go check out these particular guidelines. Again, not behind a paywall, so you should be able to access these just fine. And then I wanted to highlight, this isn't necessarily a publication of policy, but the USC Pacific Asia Museum has done an excellent job with like the notice part of it, or the outreach education part facing externally of, hey, we've got some abandoned property. We are issuing a termination notice for undocumented objects. Here's the process we went through. Here's who is responsible for it. Here's the stipulation we have in terms of, you have 3 years to claim, etc. And then they've posted it in the newspaper as well. And there's a series of newspaper posts that they did, um, most likely in fulfillment of part of that state law, in this case, California. So I thought that was an excellent execution of, you have policy, you have state law to reference, you are going through the act of deaccessioning, and in recognition of your responsibility for maintaining public trust, you are announcing and being transparent about the process of deaccessioning that you are going through, and you're doing it in making good faith effort to let your stakeholders and community know what is happening and when it's happening. So policy elements when there are items found in collection, because your deaccession policy should be intended to cover items that came into your collection officially and with paperwork, and also items that are found in collection. So first and foremost, the best policies out there are the ones that identify who is responsible for the research portion and then the determination or decision portion. Sometimes that is the same person if you're a super small shop. Sometimes it's different. I recommend using job titles versus people's names. That way the documentation stays evergreen versus like every time staff turnover happens, you have to update. Also, gather all information pertaining to that item, including any sort of institutional memory, how long the items have been in institutional care. So having the policy account for instructions on what sort of information to gather, what information is helpful, that kind of thing. And then using that, having the policy dictate the type of report or known facts reporting, with the recommendation of either needing to hold on to it for a few more years to meet state law requirements, or yes, we've had it forever. It's documented through institutional memory, so we've met state rules, we can deaccession. Speaking of which, reference the state law and any other related policies, especially if you're like an archives or museum unit underneath a larger organization. And then outline if there's a minimum custody period before deaccession can occur. So as you're putting together that report, the deaccession policy should stipulate that as part of that summary and decision, stating specifically if there's a minimum custody year that still needs to be met. And then finally, capturing if there's a notice requirement that needs to happen. So for example, the USC notice that we were just looking at, if they are doing that in order to meet part of California state law, and if that's part of your requirements under your state law, that should also be part of your deaccession policy, is this element of providing communication to the public in terms of what's happening, what specifically is considered for deaccession, and when. Acts of disposal, or the act of disposal. We've got options. So when we're thinking about disposal, and again, this is the broader term in terms of disposal means removing from collection and it's going somewhere else, whether that is the trash for disposal or somewhere like selling or a peer organization, etc. So typically for my clients, I recommend, in lieu of anything else stipulating, I recommend offering returning to the donor or the next of kin, especially if the particular item or archives is not necessarily like financially expensive or worth a lot of money. Often there's quite a bit of sentimental value, or there can be extreme importance behind that item, maybe important cultural context, etc. Offering it back to the donor or next of kin is often the best thing to do first before considering other disposal avenues. You can also consider transferring to a peer organization. This is often a great option, especially if you have quite a bit of one thing. And while that one thing is awesome, you don't need 20. So transferring to a peer organization so other people may enjoy it, other communities may enjoy it. Similarly with archives, if there's a better fit in terms of collecting mission, etc. And often if there are donors or next of kin, if they don't want it back, then they're usually quite happy to hear that there's another home it could go to. You can consider selling it, and there's the asterisk there, of course, because you need to check industry guidelines on what is acceptable, well, according to the field versus what is acceptable according to law, and needing to navigate that. Museums more so than archives in terms of considerations for when you are selling. In general, if you are selling, it usually isn't worth it unless that item is going to be worth, thousands of dollars or more. That's why you typically only see headlines or museums selling things that are worth quite a bit of money. Other cases though, and for other smaller shops, for museums and archives, I've seen clients also sell things on eBay that doesn't necessarily need to go to another museum. And so I've seen that as well. And it's just a perfectly other optional avenue of selling something. You can consider donating it. So whether it is to a different type of educational organization, or perhaps moving it into your educational department. So it's moving from being like a museum object, but more so used for like research or demonstration. And then also you could consider donating it like, when there's a lot of items and you don't necessarily have something of like unique museum quality. Goodwill is also a place where things can go to have another life that doesn't necessarily need to be in a museum or archives. And then finally, destroy or destruction. And it, even for us as collection stewards, it can seem unfathomable to destroy some sort of museum or archive item. However, for many of us who've worked in places for any amount of time, you will see things in the collection where just like it never should have made its way into the archives or museum. It is not unique in any way. It is not really worth any particular money. And so sometimes the best place for it is the trash. There's one other caveat for destruction here that I want to highlight, and that is harmful materials. So for various reasons, museums can have content that can be traumatizing or documents trauma, can be items that are very much used either in history or today to be harmful. An example of this is any sort of like World War II Nazi memorabilia, and for museums who may have way too many of like this particular Nazi patch or something, those are instances where you can consider offering it to other museums, but often all of those other museums already have way too many as well. You don't necessarily want to sell it because you're not sure who you are selling to or what happens with it after, and it can cause more harm if it goes back into the community. And so sometimes destruction of those harmful or items of trauma and genocide, that they just need to be destroyed. So there is a perfectly valid case, several cases really, of where destruction is the best option when you're deaccessioning that type of material. Offering to return to donor, there's feelings here. So we need to make sure we're being very sensitive to the feelings here. One, because we're human beings, but two, it will also help it go smoother. So begin with gratitude, reference your collecting mission, state why the object is being returned, explain just like broadly, don't need to go into policy, but just broadly like how the return helps the overall health of your collection in furthering the institution's mission, because that is one of the main reasons why we're deaccessioning. Offer referrals, if applicable, to peer museums who might be interested. Donors often really love and appreciate receiving those suggestions, if there are any. Think them again, but this time for their understanding, and then stipulate a number of days before you proceed with disposal. And I do have an example, I think, in the Q&A because someone asked for one specifically. Disposal considerations. So we talked about methods. We talked a little bit about why we might consider one method over the other, or where there's a threshold for whether it's worth it or not. And essentially, there's the following to consider: the ethics behind why you're choosing that destruction method and why that may make more sense or not, the feelings involved, particularly of the people who may have experienced harm that that item represents, whether historically and or currently, the feelings of the donor, feelings of your community, etc. The environment also, depending on what the material is, and very literally considering, like, can we recycle it instead of throw it away? Who can benefit and how? So depending on, like, oh, we can donate it to this educational, etc., instead of just tossing it. So let's do that. So considering, like, can somebody benefit from it? Because of course, we all want people to benefit instead of throwing it away. And then overall, with all of these things in mind, having the concept of do no harm. So whatever you are choosing to do and whatever you are selecting for deaccession and how to dispose it, choosing an option where you are as confident as possible, choosing to do no harm. All right. We covered a lot. We've got several very complex questions, so I will go through the questions, but as we do, if you have questions currently, do put them in the chat because we're not going to have a lot of time at the end. So go ahead and pop them in there and I'll answer them best I can, but with that said, let's go through them. Question: I'm dealing with a collection that began in 1975, but nothing was formalized until my hire in 2021. There are a lot of items with no deed of gift, or there are deeds of gift that are signed, but the descriptions are useless. For example, supplies, or 15 bottles, or assorted miscellaneous photographs. A lot of the items were never stored properly and are in cardboard boxes. A lot of it has rodent feces and urine on them. Some items are in really bad shape from neglect and will never be in shape to display. And I don't think some should even be available for research, as they could be hazardous. How do I deaccession something that has never been accessioned? Which is the crux of it, right? So first of all, I feel you on all of these, and you're not alone. So thank you for sharing these very vivid and realistic examples. In the cases where there's no paperwork, and if you're an archives versus museum, either way, I would reference you to the abandoned property laws just for like a CYA. Make sure you know the rules for your particular state. Because it's been in operation for so long, your museum, I would document, and in fact, I think I may have outlined, yes. So follow the found in collection guidance and then document how long you may have had that property, even if it's just like, oh, I remember we had that, when Susie was curator and that was 1980 or what have you. So that counts in terms of how long you've had the item or items. But I do add, given the hazardous nature and that there's risk to both the collection, but also risk to staff health and actually like research or community health too, I would argue that these items are at greater risk if they stay. So my recommendation would be to document like the extent of the items and the damage, and then run it by your board or any other sort of necessary sign-offs to evict and destroy those items. So I would recommend doing that due diligence about abandoned property, but I also want to acknowledge that the situation that you describe the collections in is not good for you or for the rest of the collection. So in this case, documentation and making like an extenuating circumstances decision and documenting how bad it is for your records is my recommendation. Question: I have a question about deaccessioning digital items. While it seems like much of the paperwork aspect of deaccessioning is similar for physical and digital items, how should one go about deaccessioning the actual digital file? They are usually being deaccessioned as they are poor quality files, so it's unlikely any other institutions would want them, as one might do with physical items. So yes, so my answer, disposal is an option. Um, I love the intent of wanting to make sure that you're considering your options and that you have outlined poor quality files probably doesn't make sense for it to go anywhere else. And so I just want to underscore disposal absolutely is an option, especially if you're not necessarily missing any like unique content or information in doing so. Um, my second distant recommendation might be like if you're practicing digital preservation methods and wanting to experiment, those may be great experiment files, but otherwise I think they can go. Question: how might we handle dispersal of potentially 50 of the same thing where we're not able to find homes in fellow institutions for more than a few and find ourselves with 20 to 30 deaccessioned objects that we still have to house? So for these particular items that you have so many, even after rehoming some of them, if there's not an option to return to the owner, you've already hit up the peer institutions, and there's no market appetite, then educational uses may be of interest, whether at your institution or another. You can consider donation, and this may be like the Goodwill donation kind of thing to consider, or disposal. So if you've sort of exhausted all the other disposal methods, there's not a market to sell, it doesn't make sense to give it to Goodwill, then disposal can be considered. Question: if we were to come to auction after all of those appropriate and proper steps to reach this outcome, of course, would we be flooding the market? So for context for everybody, a continuation on the, I think 50 of the same object, and giving some to peer institutions, but still having like 20 or 30 to deal with. So it depends, obviously, it depends on what the object is, the time of the market, if you're looking at US market versus global market, quite possibly, if you're bringing that many objects of the same thing. Doing a little bit of market research and connecting with an expert, whether that's an appraiser, whether that's reaching out to an auction house that deals with those kinds of items, would be probably my first stop in terms of like weighing, is it worth it or not? Both in terms of flooding the market, but also like, is it worth selling? What's the market value? So connecting with an expert can be helpful there. And then follow-up question: what if the market is supremely uninterested? What do those consequences look like? And so it depends on if you have the luxury of time, in terms of if you sold one or two objects a year, for example. I know you've got 20 to 30, so you're looking at a while. But if you have the patience, if you have the time, if it makes sense, then yes, you could wait and do like a drip feed of selling. You could also consider other markets. So yes, there's the US market, but you could also make sure, depending on what it is, work with an auction house, take it to different markets, that kind of thing. So you have a few different options, again, depending on like the worth it factor. And then next question: when a decision is reached to deaccession an object, what are best practices related to informing the original donors? So the typical best practice for informing donors, and if applicable, offering to return. So my recommendation is always an offer to return in that exchange. However, that doesn't necessarily need to happen. You can just inform donors, hey, we're deaccessioning, however, we intend to transfer to this museum or what have you. You can inform them of the particulars of the disposal method. The follow-up to that is, we're in a Canadian context, is returning the object to the original donor an option. And so Canada or not, US, Australia, etc., returning the object to the donor is always an option. And typically, as I've said, the one I recommend doing first, especially if the donor's still around or there's next of kin. Might you share examples of contacting donors who have given work to let them know about deaccessioning the work? So yes, so I've created a little blurb for you all, and it's pretty formulaic in terms of the points we're hitting and the order we are hitting them. As you may recall our slide a little bit earlier, we're starting out with gratitude for them having donated the item. We really lay on the, like, it was meaningful. So just because we're doing something else with the object doesn't mean it's not meaningful. We take great pride in our mission. So this is expressing and gently educating about, we have this mission, and part of why we're contacting you is because we are meeting our mission, and this is part of it. We've identified the item for deaccessioning, underscore deaccessioning as a normal part of collection stewardship, and allows us, again, emphasis for us to do our jobs, allocate resources. For this particular note, I put, before we consider alternatives, we wish to return or offer to return the item to you. I've stipulated in this case, please notify us in 30 days if that's what you want. If you've already made the decision or a partial decision, like, oh, you intend to give to this institution, you swap this sentence out for explaining that. Oftentimes I find the donors do not want it back, and they just want you to make a decision with what to do with it. So oftentimes, if you're not straight up offering to return, or if it's like a second reply, telling them specifically what your decision will be, can be very helpful, and they'll usually be very appreciative about it. All right, what are best practices for deaccessioning when the materials are found in collection? They were never accessioned in the first place. There are no accession records or inventory, no documentation, no object ID numbers. Much of our holdings are in this category. They date from the "we take everything and document nothing" period, which is a well-known period in our field, in their period of development. Are we required to use Illinois abandoned property laws for museums an 8-year period to remove these from our holdings? Quite possibly. And then, can we document that we removed and what happened to the objects, just as we would with a deaccession? Yes. We are drowning in these objects, and it's impacting our ability to collect, house, and move forward. We need an efficient and timely solution to this problem. So yes, so you're in Illinois, so you can definitely check out the Spurlock Museum example, because they also cite Illinois law. And you have reference, but making sure you review and aren't sort of being in direct conflict with whatever the abandoned property law for Illinois is. I recommend heavily investigating and using institutional memory as part of your information gathering to help correlate, even if it's a rough timeline, for when certain sets of items came in. Because if you can document that, and given that your institution in its period of just willy-nilly collecting, if you can assign like even a decade to that, like these were all collected in the 80s, then you have definitely by far met the Illinois 8-year requirement for things being considered abandoned. And for all of this, of course, it's like, it's to the best extent possible. So we may not know all the facts 100% with confidence, but to the best extent possible, we have determined this, and documentation, etc., will help with that case. So yes, document research, when the things may have came in, how you can maybe help correlate those facts, what your findings were, and your recommendation and decision based on those findings, and then ultimately the action. And it may even be worth doing like that notice like USC did, where you do a series of public notices, also in good faith, just to highlight that this was not something that was just sort of done informally or impulsively, and just another like CYA in terms of like following law, but also trying to do the right thing. And then, of course, if you have a board, if you have legal counsel, like consulting with those experts so that it's not necessarily your particular butt on the line, but having those cleared by people who may have more expertise in this area. So we've got tons of resources for you. Just real quickly, we have them organized by the different professional organizations that have provided these for us. So you have a copy of the slide deck. You can check these out. Also, as we reference them in the slides, we provided links so you can see where those were from. I do have both museum and archives in here in terms of deaccessioning resources, institutional examples, and then I also have linked the news articles that we took a look at, but as well as news articles that I used during putting the slide deck together or that I've read in the past about this particular topic. So if you enjoy reading about that, go check them out. Otherwise, thank you so much. Thanks for sticking around for this topic. It is a complex and difficult one, and we don't have it all quite figured out just yet. And yet it is such a desperately needed and important aspect of our work. So I hope you found this helpful, and I wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you.